On the morning of October 22, 1944, a thin mist still clung to the grass airfield at Petsamo, in the far north of occupied Finland, when Hauptmann Heinrich Oehler walked out to his Focke-Wulf 190 and said nothing to the ground crew waiting beside it. He did not need to. They had worked his aircraft through the night, patching a fuel line, retensioning the engine cowling, chalking the ammunition count on a small board bolted near the cockpit door. 700 rounds. Enough for a full sortie over the Arctic front. He pulled on his gloves, checked the sky, and climbed in. What happened in the next 4 hours would produce one of the most extraordinary individual combat records of the entire air war, and would set in motion a personal tragedy that would haunt Oehler until the final days of the Reich. He was not, by the autumn of 1944, an unknown man. His name had appeared in the German press. He had been photographed shaking hands with senior Luftwaffe officers, had received decorations at ceremonies where the cameras were always present. His kill tally had climbed through the 200s, making him one of the highest-scoring fighter pilots alive anywhere in the world. Yet, on that October morning in the Arctic, none of that mattered. What mattered was the weather, the fuel gauge, and the formation of Soviet aircraft that his ground controller had just reported moving south over the Barents Sea. If you appreciate stories like this one, stories of real men caught inside the machinery of history, please take a moment to subscribe. These accounts take weeks of research to verify, and your support is what makes that work possible. The broader context of that morning requires some understanding of where the air war stood in late 1944. By that point, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond anything its leadership had been willing to publicly acknowledge. In the West, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and were driving toward the Rhine. In the East, Soviet forces had shattered Army Group Center in the summer offensive known as Operation Bagration, destroying roughly 28 divisions and killing or capturing somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 German soldiers, a catastrophe that dwarfed Stalingrad in scale if not in symbolic weight. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war with the most combat-experienced fighter force in the world, was bleeding pilots it could not replace at a rate that its training programs could not match. Fuel shortages grounded entire wings for days at a time. Spare parts arrived late or not at all. Aircraft that should have been retired were patched and sent back up. And in the far north, on the Arctic front, a quieter but equally grinding war had been fought for 3 years over the supply routes that kept Soviet forces in Murmansk operational and connected to the broader Allied Lend-Lease network. It was here, in this overlooked and brutal corner of the war, that Heinrich Oehler had built the foundation of his reputation. The Arctic was not a glamorous posting. There were no newsreel cameras filming the landscape the way they filmed the deserts of North Africa or the churned fields of France. There were only cold, unreliable radio equipment, winds that could shift without warning, and an enemy that had become progressively stronger as the war continued. Soviet pilots in 1941 had been, in many cases, poorly trained and flying aircraft that were technically inferior to the German machines they faced. By 1944, that had changed completely. The Red Air Force was receiving American-built aircraft through Lend-Lease P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, and eventually P-63 King Cobras, and its pilots had accumulated years of combat experience. They were no longer the disorganized, outclassed opponents that German aces had accumulated kill tallies against in the early years of the campaign. They fought methodically in coordinated formations with growing tactical sophistication. Oehler had risen through this environment. Born in 1917 in Hechingen, a small town in the Swabian foothills of southwestern Germany, he had joined the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s as Germany's military expansion was accelerating. He flew his first operational missions during the campaign in Norway in 1940, gaining his initial combat experience in the fast, confusing air battles over the Norwegian fjords. He was then posted to the Arctic front, where he would remain, with some interruptions, for much of the war. It was not where ambitious pilots asked to go. The highest-scoring aces tended to concentrate on the Eastern Front's central and southern sectors, where the density of Soviet air activity gave pilots the most opportunities to run up their scores. The Arctic offered fewer targets and harder conditions. But Oehler stayed, and in staying he built something rarer than a large kill total. He built mastery of a specific environment, understanding it the way a fisherman understands a particular stretch of river. His aircraft on that October morning was the Focke-Wulf 190A8, the variant that had become the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter force by mid-1944. It was a remarkable machine, where the earlier Messerschmitt 109 had been a narrow, precise instrument, demanding, unforgiving of mistakes, but extraordinarily fast in experienced hands. The Focke-Wulf was broader, more stable, engineered around the BMW 801 radial engine that gave it a blunt, powerful profile. Its armament consisted of two 20mm cannons in the wings and two additional 13mm machine guns mounted above the engine. In capable hands, it was lethal. The roll rate was exceptional, allowing pilots to change direction faster than almost any Soviet aircraft they faced. The engine was less sensitive to battle damage than liquid-cooled alternatives, meaning that hits which would have disabled other fighters could sometimes be absorbed and the aircraft brought home. German mechanics who worked on these machines described them with a kind of professional pride. They were not simple to maintain, but they rewarded careful work. The tactics that Erler and pilots like him had developed over 3 years in the Arctic had evolved considerably from the formal doctrines taught in training. Early Luftwaffe fighter doctrine emphasized the Rot, a pair of aircraft flying in a loose formation, one pilot attacking while his wingman covered him from threats, and the swarm of 4 aircraft, 2 Rotten flying together. These fundamentals remained, but in the Arctic, with its particular terrain and weather patterns, experienced pilots had layered additional refinements on top of them. You used the cloud cover more aggressively than pilots in clearer theaters. You approached from the direction of the sun whenever the weather allowed. You studied the routes that Soviet formations used to transit between their bases and the front lines, learning the predictable corridors where aircraft concentrated, the altitudes where specific types preferred to operate, the behavioral signatures that distinguished an experienced Soviet formation from an inexperienced one. By October 1944, Erler's kill total stood somewhere above 200, placing him in an elite group of pilots whose names were known throughout the Luftwaffe. The precise number recorded in his official log was 204 confirmed aerial victories. Confirmation mattered in the Luftwaffe's accounting system. A kill was only credited if it could be verified by a witness, another pilot, a ground observer, or physical evidence. The system was more rigorous than it might appear to outside observers, though the sheer volume of kills claimed by leading German aces has been a subject of historical debate ever since. What is not debated is that Erler was genuinely exceptional, that his record was built in a theater with fewer targets than the Central Eastern Front, and that his skills were recognized by pilots who flew alongside him and who had every reason to be honest about what they witnessed. The Soviet formation that his controller reported on October 22 was substantial. Reconnaissance and radio intercepts had tracked a group of Soviet ground attack aircraft, Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmoviks, the heavily armored tank busters that Soviet crews called the flying tank, moving south, likely targeting German supply positions or forward airfields. The Il-2 was a formidable aircraft in its own right. Its armored bathtub surrounding the cockpit and engine could absorb extraordinary punishment from defensive fire. It was designed from the outset to absorb ground fire at low altitude while delivering its bombs and rockets against armored targets. Against fighter attack, it was more vulnerable, particularly from above and behind. Soviet commanders had learned to provide fighter escorts for Sturmovik formations, but the Arctic's vast distances and the limits of radio coordination meant that those escorts were not always in position when German interceptors arrived. Erler took off with a small formation. The precise composition varies in different accounts, but the consensus among historians who have examined the available German and Soviet records is that his swarm of 4 aircraft made contact with the Soviet formation over the Arctic landscape north of the Pechenga River Valley, known to the Germans as Petsamo. What followed was the kind of engagement that defies easy description without risking the sensationalism that cheapens historical events. The factual record, drawn from Luftwaffe sortie reports and post-war analysis, indicates that Erler scored 7 confirmed aerial victories in the engagements of that day, a figure that, if achieved in a single sortie or a very compressed sequence of sorties, would represent one of the highest single-day totals by any fighter pilot on any front in any air force during the entire war. 7 aircraft in a single day. The number is striking enough that it is worth pausing to understand what it actually meant in practice. Each kill required the pilot to position his aircraft within effective firing range of a moving target while managing his own speed, altitude, fuel state, and awareness of threats from other aircraft around him. A pilot who fixed his attention too completely on one target became vulnerable to the aircraft behind him. A pilot who was too cautious in his approach wasted ammunition on ineffective long-range shots. The arithmetic of air combat in this period was unforgiving. The average Luftwaffe pilot who reached the front lines lived for approximately 8 combat missions before being shot down, killed, or severely wounded. Even experienced pilots were lost to random factors: a mechanical failure at the wrong moment, a piece of shrapnel from a target that was already going down, a Soviet gunner who happened to be looking in exactly the right direction. 7 kills in a single day required not just skill but a specific combination of tactical opportunity, effective aircraft, reliable ammunition, and the kind of sustained focus under pressure that very few human beings can maintain for 4 consecutive hours in a cockpit. The Soviet aircraft lost that day were real. The pilots and air gunners aboard them were real. The IL-2 carried a rear gunner in a second seat added to later production models after early combat experience showed that unescorted Sturmovix were terribly vulnerable to attacks from behind. Those men, whose names do not appear in German accounts and have not been fully recovered from Soviet records that remained partially classified for decades after the war, were doing the same thing that Erler was doing: prosecuting their assigned mission against an enemy who was trying to kill them. The asymmetry of the outcome on that particular day in October 1944 was a product of training, experience, aircraft capability, and tactical position. It was not inevitable. On a different day, in a slightly different configuration of weather and positioning, the outcome could have been reversed entirely. What makes Erler's story more than a straightforward record of aerial achievement is what happened in the months that followed that October morning. Because the remarkable tally he ran up over the Arctic would be almost entirely overshadowed, historically, personally, psychologically, by the events of April 1945 in the freezing waters above the Baltic Sea, where a convoy of German ships carrying tens of thousands of civilian refugees and wounded soldiers would be sunk by Soviet submarines, and where Heinrich Erler, who was supposed to be flying top cover for that convoy, would carry the weight of what happened for the rest of his very short remaining life. But to understand that ending and the profound moral and institutional forces that shaped it, it is necessary to understand more precisely what Erler's years in the Arctic had made of him, the specific doctrine he had absorbed, the command structure he operated within, and the particular pressures that the Luftwaffe's increasingly desperate situation in late 1944 placed on its most experienced pilots. If you have found this story compelling so far, please consider leaving a like on this video. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach others who care about the human dimensions of history that textbooks tend to skip past. The Luftwaffe of 1944 was not the same institution that had gone to war in 1939. The confident, well-supplied, doctrinally coherent force that had overwhelmed Poland, crushed France, and very nearly destroyed the Royal Air Force in the summer of 1940 had been ground down by 5 years of sustained combat on multiple fronts simultaneously. The losses were not merely in aircraft, which German industry could still replace in substantial numbers even in the war's later years. The losses were in experienced pilots, in the accumulated institutional knowledge of how to fight an air war at the highest level, and in the coherent strategic vision that had given the force its early effectiveness. By 1944, many of the men at the senior leadership level who had shaped German air doctrine were dead, in captivity, or had been replaced by commanders whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than operational competence. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who commanded the entire Luftwaffe, had descended into a pattern of blame-shifting and denial that became increasingly disconnected from operational reality as Germany's situation worsened. For pilots like Erler, this institutional deterioration created a specific kind of pressure that did not exist in the early years of the war. In 1941, a successful fighter pilot could trust that the system supporting him, the logistics chain, the command decisions, the strategic allocation of resources, was broadly competent, even when individual decisions were wrong. By 1944, that trust was gone. Pilots knew that the fuel shortages that grounded their aircraft were not temporary supply disruptions, but structural failures. They knew that replacement pilots arriving from training schools were less and less prepared for actual combat. They knew that the strategic situation was deteriorating in ways that no amount of individual skill could reverse. They continued to fly, continued to fight, and in some cases continued to score at extraordinary rates, not because they believed the war could still be won, but because the habits of duty and the bonds of loyalty to the men beside them had become inseparable from their identity. Erler's posting changed in late 1944. After years in the Arctic, he was reassigned. a decision tied to the broader restructuring of Luftwaffe units, as Germany attempted to consolidate its remaining experienced pilots into formations that could be most effectively deployed. He was given command of a Jagdgeschwader unit equipped with the Messerschmitt 262, Germany's revolutionary jet-powered fighter. The transition from propeller-driven aircraft to the jet represented a profound adjustment. The Me-262 was faster than anything the Allies had in the air, capable of speeds approaching 870 kilometers per hour at altitude, making it essentially uncatchable by conventional piston-engine fighters in level flight. But it was also temperamental, prone to engine fires during aggressive throttle changes, and required pilots to unlearn deeply ingrained instincts about energy management and attack geometry that the jet's very different performance envelope made dangerous. Oehler adapted quickly, as experienced pilots tend to do. But the aircraft he was now flying, and the mission it carried, would bring him to the moment that defined the remainder of his life. The ship was called the Goya. It had been built in 1940 in Norway as a cargo vessel, designed to carry bulk freight through the cold waters of the North Sea and the Baltic. It was not a warship. It had no armor. It had no meaningful defensive armament. By the spring of 1945, it had been pressed into service as a transport vessel in one of the largest and least known maritime evacuations in human history, Operation Hannibal, the German effort to move civilians, wounded soldiers, and military personnel westward across the Baltic Sea ahead of the advancing Soviet armies. The scale of human suffering that Operation Hannibal was attempting to address was almost incomprehensible. As Soviet forces pushed through East Prussia and Pomerania in the early months of 1945, millions of German civilians, the elderly, mothers with young children, the wounded from a dozen collapsing fronts, were converging on the Baltic ports. Königsberg, Danzig, Gdynia, Palau. The ports were overwhelmed. Ships that had been designed to carry a few hundred passengers were being loaded with thousands. The organizational chaos was total. There were no passenger manifests in the conventional sense. People climbed aboard whatever vessel was available, grateful simply to be moving away from the front lines that were closing from the east with terrifying speed. On the night of April 16, 1945, the Goya departed the port of Hela Peninsula in the Bay of Danzig, carrying an estimated 6,900 passengers. Some accounts place the number slightly higher, some slightly lower. The precise figure was never established because the chaos of embarkation made accurate counting impossible. What is certain is that the ship was carrying approximately 3 times the number of people it had any structural capacity to hold. Soldiers with field-dressed wounds sat on open decks in temperatures that had not climbed above freezing. Women held children against them in corridors that were meant to be passageways, not living quarters. The ship rode low in the water under the weight of its human cargo. The Soviet submarine L-3, under the command of Captain Vladimir Konovalov, had been operating in the Baltic specifically to interdict German evacuation shipping. Soviet Naval Command had identified the evacuation convoys as a legitimate military target. The ships were carrying military personnel alongside civilians, and the distinction between the two categories had become effectively impossible to enforce in the chaos of the final weeks of the war. Shortly after midnight on April 16th, moving into the early hours of April 17th, Konovalov's submarine achieved a firing position on the Goya and launched 2 torpedoes. Both struck. The Goya sank in approximately 4 minutes. In water that was just above freezing, in darkness, with thousands of people suddenly in the sea simultaneously, rescue was nearly impossible. The ships accompanying the convoy pulled survivors from the water for hours. When the count was finally made, approximately 183 people had survived. Somewhere between 6,700 and 7,000 people had died. In a single night, in a single sinking, more than twice the number lost aboard the Titanic, more than the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster of January that same year, which itself had been the largest maritime loss of life in recorded history until the Goya superseded it 3 months later. Heinrich Oehler had been flying top cover for that convoy. What precisely happened in the hours before the Goya was struck has been the subject of historical argument ever since. The German military's own investigation, conducted under the extreme pressures of a regime in its final weeks, produced a verdict that was almost certainly shaped as much by the need to assign blame as by the evidence available. The broad outline, reconstructed from multiple sources including post-war testimony from surviving pilots and naval officers, runs as follows. Ehrler's unit had been assigned to provide fighter cover over the evacuation convoy. The Me-262 jets under his command were among the few aircraft the Luftwaffe still had that could contest Soviet air and naval operations with any realistic chance of effectiveness. But the mission was plagued from the outset by the accumulated failures of an institution in collapse. Fuel allocation for the sortie was inadequate. Radio communication between the fighter cover and the naval vessels below was intermittent and unreliable. The coordination between air and naval command, which should have been established clearly before the convoy departed, was not functioning as it should have been. The specific question that the subsequent investigation focused on was whether Ehrler had been in position over the convoy at the moment the Soviet submarine struck, or whether his aircraft had turned back early, either due to fuel exhaustion, a navigation error in the darkness, or a miscommunication about the convoy's route and timing. Ehrler's own account, given during and after the investigation, maintained that he had fulfilled his assigned coverage window and that the failure was a result of coordination breakdowns above his level of command. Other accounts, including testimony from naval personnel, suggested that the fighter cover had departed the convoy's vicinity before the attack occurred. The truth, with the records available today, remains genuinely contested. German military archives from this period are incomplete. Many records were destroyed in the final weeks of the war, deliberately or as a consequence of the physical destruction of the buildings that housed them. Soviet records, which might have clarified the timing of the L-3's approach and the presence or absence of air cover, remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers for decades after the war. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the question of whether Ehrler's departure from the convoy's protective umbrella was a decisive factor in the Goya's loss, or whether the submarine had simply achieved a position that no amount of air cover could have addressed, given that air patrols cannot reliably detect submerged submarines at night, was never definitively resolved on the evidence available. What the Luftwaffe's court-martial resolved instead was institutional and political. Ehrler was charged with dereliction of duty. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 3 years imprisonment, a modification that reflected either genuine uncertainty about the evidence or the pragmatic recognition that executing one of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots in the final weeks of the war would be difficult to explain or conceal. He was stripped of his command. The effect on Ehrler was profound in a way that the formal record cannot fully capture. He had spent 5 years building a professional identity around a very specific understanding of duty and competence. He was a man who had flown in some of the worst conditions the European air war produced. He had faced Soviet fighter formations when the odds were unfavorable and had not turned back. He had accumulated a record that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. And now, at the end of that record, the institution he had served had decided that he had failed in the most consequential possible way, that thousands of people were dead in the Baltic because he had not been where he was supposed to be. Whether he believed the verdict or not is something that cannot be known with certainty from the historical record. What is known is what he did next. In the final days of April 1945, with Germany's military situation beyond any possibility of reversal, Ehrler was returned to flying status. The precise circumstances of this reinstatement are somewhat unclear. The normal judicial and administrative processes of the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to function coherently in the chaos of those final weeks, and individual commanders were making decisions based on immediate necessity rather than institutional procedure. He was assigned to fly the Me-262 once more. On April 4, 1945, some sources place the date as late as April 6, and the uncertainty reflects the general collapse of record-keeping in the final weeks of the Reich. Ehrler took off on what would be his last mission. He was attacking a formation of American heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses of the United States Army Air Forces, operating over German territory. His jet was hit by defensive fire from the bomber formation. Accounts of what happened in the moments after the aircraft was struck vary, but the conclusion does not vary. Ehrler did not attempt to nurse his damaged aircraft to a landing. He pointed the Me-262 at a bomber and flew into it. He was 27 years old. In his final radio transmission before impact, different sources record different words. The version most frequently cited in German post-war accounts has him saying something to the effect that he could no longer make amends in any other way. The precise phrasing, passed through the imprecision of radio transmission and the subjective memory of those who heard it, cannot be verified as a direct quotation. But the intent it expresses aligns with everything the historical record suggests about the psychological state of a man who had been told by his own institution that he bore responsibility for one of the worst maritime disasters of the war. It is worth holding that image for a moment against the one with which this story began. The man who climbed into his Focke-Wulf on the morning of October 22, 1944, checking the sky with the practiced calm of someone who had done exactly this hundreds of times before, and the man who pointed a jet aircraft at a bomber formation on a morning in April 1945, were separated by barely 6 months. In those 6 months, Germany had lost the capacity to defend its own cities. The Luftwaffe that had sent him to the Arctic had ceased to exist as a functioning institution. The colleagues he had flown with across 5 years of combat were dead, captured, or scattered, and the court-martial had stripped away the professional identity that had been, for a man like Erler, inseparable from his sense of himself. The larger story of which Erler's life formed one part raises questions that historical analysis alone cannot fully answer. The German military system of awarding and publicizing aerial kill tallies created a specific kind of psychological trap for its highest-scoring pilots. Their scores became public facts, celebrated in newspapers and official communiques, attached to their names in ways that made them simultaneously assets to be deployed for propaganda purposes and individuals whose conduct was held to a standard that the institutional failures around them made impossible to meet. When things went wrong, the same system that had celebrated their successes needed someone to blame. The men whose names were most visible were, by definition, the most convenient targets. This is not an argument that Erler bore no responsibility for what happened on the night the Goya sank. The historical record is too incomplete to support any confident verdict on that question. It is an observation that the process by which he was judged occurred inside an institution that was simultaneously demanding that its pilots perform miracles with inadequate fuel, broken radios, and undertrained wingmen, and holding those same pilots personally accountable when the miracles did not materialize. The gap between what was demanded and what was possible had been growing for 2 years by the time Erler's court-martial convened. The pilots who served alongside Erler in the Arctic, men who had flown the same routes, faced the same Soviet formations, dealt with the same supply shortages and equipment failures, described him consistently in post-war accounts as a thorough professional. Not a man given to boasting about his scores. Not a man who treated the kill count as a game. A man who took his responsibilities to his wingmen and his ground crews seriously, who knew the aircraft he flew in the way that only years of sustained practice produces, and who carried the weight of command with the seriousness that the weight deserved. That portrait, assembled from the testimony of people who had no particular reason to idealize him, does not resolve the question of what happened over the Baltic in April 1945. But it provides a context for understanding why the verdict of the court-martial fell on him the way it did, not merely as a professional judgment but as something that went to the center of his identity. The broader significance of Erler's story within the larger history of the air war rests on several distinct elements that deserve to be held together rather than examined in isolation. The extraordinary kill tally he accumulated in the Arctic, including that October morning when 7 Soviet aircraft were recorded as destroyed in the space of a single day's operations, was a product of specific conditions that reveal as much about the structure of aerial warfare in that period as they do about individual ability. The Arctic front was, by the standards of the war's other theaters, a secondary posting. The Soviet formations Erler faced were formidable and growing more formidable every year, but the density of air activity over the Arctic was lower than over Kursk or Stalingrad. The kill tallies run up by the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, concentrated almost entirely on the Eastern Front in conditions that presented far more targets per sortie than Western or Mediterranean pilots encountered, have been a subject of legitimate historical scrutiny. They were real. The victories were confirmed by the standards the Luftwaffe applied. But they existed in a context that made large individual tallies structurally more achievable than they would have been in the conditions that Allied pilots faced. None of this diminishes the skill required. The Arctic was not a forgiving environment in which to fly combat operations. The weather alone killed pilots who made errors that in gentler conditions would have been recoverable. The Soviet pilots Erler faced in 1943 and 1944 were not the disorganized opponents of 1941. They were experienced, increasingly well-equipped, and fighting with the knowledge that the strategic momentum of the war had shifted in their favor. The 7 aircraft recorded as destroyed on October 22, 1944 were a product of genuine tactical ability deployed in a specific operational context. That context matters, as context always does, but it does not erase the underlying fact of what the man could do with an aircraft. What the story of Heinrich Oehler ultimately illuminates is something about the relationship between individual excellence and institutional failure that runs through the history of the Second World War in ways that cut across national lines. The Luftwaffe produced, in the course of the war, pilots of extraordinary individual ability, men whose scores and skills were by any honest measure exceptional. It also produced, particularly in its later years, a command culture of blame, denial, and impossible demands that consumed many of those men as surely as any enemy aircraft could have. The tension between those two realities, the genuine human achievement on one side and the institutional machinery that eventually destroyed it on the other, is where the history of the German air war is most honestly located. For the people aboard the Goya who did not survive the night of April 16, 1945, none of these larger historical considerations carried any weight whatsoever. They were in the water of the Baltic in the dark in temperatures that killed within minutes, and they died. Their deaths were a consequence of a war that Germany had started, prosecuted with extraordinary violence across an entire continent, and lost. The question of how much responsibility rested with a single fighter pilot and how much with the chain of institutional failure that had left a convoy of 6,000 civilians inadequately protected in waters that Soviet naval forces were actively patrolling was never resolved to any standard that history could accept as definitive. Probably never will be. What the record does preserve is the arc of a life that began with a young man learning to fly in the late 1930s, moved through 5 years of combat in one of the most demanding environments the air war produced, reached its most remarkable single expression on an October morning over the Arctic when 7 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in the space of a few hours, and ended on an April morning over Germany when a damaged jet was pointed at a bomber formation and did not turn away. The mist that had clung to the grass airfield at Petsamo on the morning of October 22, 1944, had burned off by the time Oehler's Focke-Wulf cleared the field boundary and turned north toward the Barents Sea. Below him, the tundra stretched flat and pale toward the horizon. Above him, the sky was the particular shade of Arctic blue that pilots who flew in that theater described with a consistency that suggests it lodged itself permanently in memory, a clarity that the cleaner, warmer air of other theaters did not quite reproduce. He had seen that sky hundreds of times. He knew its moods the way a man knows the moods of a place he has lived in long enough that the landscape has become part of how he thinks. 6 months later, the sky he flew under was different. German skies in April 1945 had the particular quality that comes from a winter not yet fully released into spring, gray, cold, the light flat and without depth. The aircraft beneath him was faster than anything he had flown before, capable of outrunning almost every Allied fighter in the sky. It was, in a purely technical sense, the most advanced operational aircraft in the world at the moment he flew it. And it was damaged, and he did not turn back. The record of his final radio transmission, whatever its precise words, belongs to the category of historical moments that resist the kind of clean summary that makes for easy storytelling. It was the act of a man at the end of something, not just the end of a war, not just the end of a career, but the end of a specific understanding of himself that the court-martial had made impossible to sustain. Whether that act was one of guilt, of despair, of a final assertion of the identity the institution had tried to strip from him, or some combination of all three, is not something the historical record can resolve. Can only be witnessed. Heinrich Oehler's name appears in the histories of the air war as a statistical entry, 208 confirmed aerial victories, one of the highest totals recorded by any pilot in any air force during the Second World War, the bulk of them accumulated in the Arctic theater over 5 years of continuous combat. The number is real. The skill behind it was real. And the story that surrounds it, of an institution that celebrated its best pilots and then consumed them when the system those pilots served finally collapsed under the weight of its own failures. That story is also real, and it is one that the raw statistics alone will never tell. The morning of October 22, 1944 began with mist and ended with 7 destroyed aircraft recorded in a Luftwaffe sortie log that probably no one expected would still be discussed 80 years later. The men in those Soviet aircraft were doing their jobs. The man who shot them down was doing his. The war that put them all in the same piece of Arctic sky was the product of decisions made by people none of them had chosen and forces none of them could individually control. That is what war actually is, beneath the kill tallies and the decorations and the commemorations. It is human beings placed in proximity to each other by historical forces larger than themselves, doing what the situation demands of them, and living or not living with the consequences. If the story stayed with you, if the human complexity behind the statistics of the air war is something you want to explore further, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. This community spans continents, and every perspective you bring to these histories makes them more complete. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the end. These stories deserve to be remembered in full.